clothesline to the bloated corpse that points the way. Now step upon the stone molders, up, 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 where we shall gather once again in the ancient skull of the giant wizard, where I, the Goblin Toad, will tell that terror tale to chill your blood. Ever have one of those days when you don't want to get out of bed? Well, the character in tonight's terror tale stayed in bed for 15 years. As Guy de Maupassant relates it in his blood-curdling bedtime tale, The Mad Woman.
The Mad Woman by Guy de Maupassant. I can tell you a terrible story about the Franco-Prussian War, said Monsieur Dandelin to some friends assembled in the smoking room of Baron de Ravoux' chateau. You know my house in the Faubourg des Cormiers? I was living there when the Prussians came, and I had for a neighbor a kind of a madwoman who had lost her senses in consequence of a series of misfortunes. At the age of 27, she had lost her father, her husband, and her newly born child, all in the space of a month. When death has once entered into a house, it almost invariably returns immediately, as if it knew the way. And the young woman, overwhelmed with grief, took to her bed and was delirious for 6 weeks. Then a species of calm lassitude succeeded that violent crisis, and she remained motionless, eating next to nothing, and only moving her eyes. Every time they tried to make her get up, she screamed as if they were about to kill her, and so they ended by leaving her continually in bed, and only taking her out to wash her, to change her sheets, and to turn her mattress. An old servant remained with her to give her something to drink, or a little cold meat from time to time. What passed in that despairing mind, no one ever knew, for she did not speak at all now. Was she thinking of the dead? Was she dreaming sadly without any precise recollection of anything that had happened? Or was her memory as stagnant as water without any current? But however this may have been, for 15 years she remained thus inert and secluded. The war broke out, and in the beginning of December the Germans came to Cormier. I can remember it if it were but yesterday. It was freezing hard enough to split the stones, and I myself was lying back in an armchair, being unable to move on account of the gout, when I heard their heavy and regular tread, and could see them pass from my window. They filed past interminably, with that peculiar motion of a puppet on wires which belongs to them. Then the officers billeted their men on the inhabitants, and I had 17 of them. My neighbor, the madwoman, had a dozen, one of whom was the Commandant, a regular, violent, surly swashbuckler. During the first few days, everything went on as usual. The officers next door had been told that the lady was ill, and they did not trouble themselves about that in the least. But soon that woman, whom they never saw, irritated them. They asked what her illness was, and were told that she had been in bed for 15 years in consequence of terrible grief. No doubt they did not believe it, and thought that the poor mad creature would not leave her bed out of pride, so that she might not come near the Prussians, or speak to them, or even see them. The Commandant insisted upon her receiving him. He was shown into the room, and he said to her roughly, "I must beg you to get up, madam, and to come downstairs so that we may all see you." But she merely turned her vague eyes on him without replying. And so he continued, "I do not intend to tolerate any insolence, and if you do not get up of your own accord, I can easily find means to make you walk without any assistance." But she did not give any signs of having heard him, and remained quite motionless. Then he got furious, taking that calm silence for a mark of supreme contempt. So he added, "If you do not come downstairs tomorrow." And then he left the room. The next day, the terrified old servant wished to dress her, but the madwoman began to scream violently and resisted with all her might. The officer ran upstairs quickly, and the servant threw herself at his feet and cried, "She will not come down, monsieur. She will not. Forgive her, for she is so unhappy." The soldier was embarrassed, and in spite of his anger, he did not venture to order his soldiers to drag her out. But suddenly he began to laugh and gave some orders in German, and soon a party of soldiers was seen coming out, supporting a mattress as if they were carrying a wounded man. On that bed, the madwoman, who was still silent, was lying very quietly, for she was entirely indifferent to anything that went on, as long as they let her lie. Behind her, a soldier was carrying a parcel of feminine attire, and the officer said, rubbing his hands, "We will just see whether you cannot dress yourself alone, and take a little walk." And then the procession went off in the direction of the forest of Imauville. In 2 hours, the soldiers came back alone, and nothing more was seen of the mad woman. What had they done with her? Where had they taken her to? No one knew. The snow was falling day and night, and enveloped the plain and the woods in a shroud of frozen foam. And the wolves came and howled at our very doors. The thought of that poor lost woman haunted me, and I made several applications to the Prussian authorities in order to obtain some information, and was nearly shot for doing so. When spring returned, the army of occupation withdrew, but my neighbor's house remained closed. The old servant had died during the winter, and nobody troubled any longer about the occurrence. I alone thought about it constantly. What had they done with the woman? Had she escaped through the forest? Had somebody found her and taken her to a hospital without being able to obtain any information from her? Nothing happened to relieve my doubts, but by degrees, time assuaged my fears. Well, in the following autumn, the woodcocks were very plentiful, and as my gout had left me for a time, I dragged myself as far as the forest. I had already killed 4 or 5 of the long-billed birds when I knocked over one which fell into a ditch full of branches, and I was obliged to get into it in order to pick it up. And I found that it had fallen close to a dead human body. Immediately, the recollection of the mad woman struck me like a blow in the chest. Many other people had perhaps died in the wood during that disastrous year, but though I do not know why, I was sure I tell you that I could see the head of that wretched maniac. And suddenly I understood. I guessed everything. They had abandoned her on that mattress in the cold, deserted wood, and, faithful to her fixed idea, she had allowed herself to perish under that thick and light counterpane of snow, without moving either arms or limbs. Then the wolves had devoured her, and the birds had built their nests with the wool from her torn bed, and I took charge of her bones. I only pray that we may never see any wars again.